I can't believe the bastards have pushed me this far, but I actually have to defend John Kerry. It's something I never imagined that I would do in my entire life. John Kerry has been someone who I have never been on the same side of on any issue that I can think of in my entire life. I mean, my first memory of John Kerry was when he ran for president in 2004. I was very young back then. And I've never found an occasion where I was on his side. And even, I guess in this case, I still am not on his side, in the sense that this whole ordeal with John Kerry supposedly betraying our greatest ally, Israel, and going and tattletaling on them to Iran is utter nonsense, but not for the reason he says. He just denies it never happened. He says, let me get to the accusation. So the accusation comes from a leaked interview that was done. It was not supposed to be something that was made public, with Zarif, who is the foreign minister of Iran. I think as far as guys in Iran go, now maybe because he's the foreign face, he's supposed to be the one who's more presentable, but he seems like a decent guy. He's by no means, a madman that you can't deal with. And apparently, this was a pretty candid interview. There's a lot of stuff in this interview that, if it's being translated correctly, makes Zarif, I think, seem like a more sympathetic figure. But it was just sort of an offhanded comment that he made that John Kerry ended up being the person who told him the exact number of how many times Iran and Iranian assets were attacked in Syria by Israel. This was in the context of him complaining about how the Iranian military just completely walked all over him and had no respect for him as the foreign minister. Which in most countries is a pretty important post, being the foreign minister. That's the equivalent of our Secretary of State here in the U.S. And the military, should not be, in most countries, going behind the back of the foreign ministry or the State Department. Ideally, diplomats and the military work towards common goals, through different means. And Zarif was lamenting that he did not have that kind of relationship with Qasem Soleimani, the guy that Trump assassinated last year, was it? No, it was the year before, I think. And so his point in telling the story about Kerry was that, he is so, his relationship with Soleimani was so distant that he was not being updated on how many times Iran was being attacked by Israel in the Syrian war. Now, for some reason, in American media, well, I shouldn't say for some reason, it's obvious, American media has decided to spin this story as John Kerry sold out Israel to Zarif and Iran and told them all these things. First of all, Iran overall, the country, knows full well, as far as the government goes, the Iranian government, the IRGC, the mullahs, they're people, they know exactly how many times Israel has attacked them in Syria. Everyone knows that. If you follow OSINT Twitter, which stands for Open Source Intelligence, it's quite obvious every time Israel attacks Iran in Syria, because jets leave Israel, suddenly an Iranian connected site in Syria explodes, and then jets fly back into Syria, or into Israel. So it's pretty obvious. Israel scrambles jets, they fly to Syria, bomb Iran, and then fly back. This goes on all the time. Everyone knows it. I've been following it for years. It's just a common thing that you see in the news. Now, Israel officially doesn't confirm any of these things, because Israel never confirms nor denies any military actions that they take outside of their own borders. Israel they don't talk about it. That's their policy. That doesn't mean that it's a secret, though. Everyone knows that this is going on. It's not even an open secret. It's not a secret of any kind. So just the fact that John Kerry happened to have added up the number to over 200 by whatever point he was talking to Zarif, that Iran had been bombed by Israel in Syria, this is not some kind of a top secret information. It's open source. So John Kerry, in this case, did nothing wrong. I mean, this is This is not anything that was. There's just, at least from what we know now, because again, if I didn't make it clear, this is from a recording of an interview that Zarif did with some historian in Farsi. Okay, so in their native language in Iran, that was apparently leaked to some news outlet in the UK. And then we're getting excerpts of it, or like little clips, translated in English and transcribed. So we don't know how faithful that translation is. We don't know the full context necessarily of each of these clips, even if they are being translated properly. So there's a huge margin for error in what is being published here. So we don't even know if what we're reading necessarily is totally representative of what Zarif said. But anyway, just from a common sense standpoint, even if the narrative that you're getting from the CNNs and the Fox Newses of the world, that John Kerry he revealed this to Zarif, and Zarif had no idea what was going on. It just doesn't make sense. Because if these are Iranian assets being bombed, because again, in this story, they're not presenting it, they don't go through the nuance of Zarif is one person within the Iranian government who feels he was being sidelined by the rest of the Iranian government. They're talking about, when they refer to Iran, they're just talking about Zarif. Iran obviously knew that they were being bombed by Israel. If they get bombed, they know, well, Assad didn't do it, and Al-Qaeda doesn't have jets. So who's left then? It's not the Americans. It's Israel. So unless, John Kerry told Zarif, hey, Israel's going to attack this site at this time on this day in the future, and, Iran was able to, I guess, prepare for that, there was nothing that he did that in any way revealed anything that Israel was doing that everyone else didn't already know. So even if you are someone who thinks, oh, our greatest ally, we can't betray them, he didn't even do that. He's not being accused of that. He's not being accused of giving Iran any kinds of warnings about Israeli airstrikes. I doubt John Kerry would know necessarily the exact times that Israel's going to conduct airstrikes. So this is an idiotic story that is really just meant to it's kind of like all foreign policy stories in the United States. It's meant for people who don't really pay attention to stuff that much to hear a headline that doesn't sound good to them, and then they think, oh, well, that's bad, and then they go back to sleep, and they don't look that deeply into it. Like this morning, I first heard about this story. Apparently, this broke yesterday. I first heard about this story from my father, who had heard it on the radio, and he said, oh, did you hear what John Kerry did? He told Iran all these secrets about military secrets of Israel or whatever, and I thought, that sounds fishy to me. I don't believe that. And so I had to look into it, and lo and behold, it's total BS. So it's more than likely whoever did this either wanted to put pressure on the Biden administration in the U.S. to make them feel like make them seem like they're really soft on Iran, so that they can't do anything to try and rejoin the Iran deal, which it didn't seem like the Biden folks were that keen on doing anyway. They're not being very aggressive about that. I mean, their supposed talks with Iran are indirect, to where they're both in the same hotel, staying at the same hotel, but then they're sending like go-betweens back and forth. It's ridiculous, like beyond high school level immature talks, if I could use that in scare quotes. So the Biden folks are by no means at all warming up to Iran. But I guess a story like this is just supposed to make sure that Iran, that talking to Iran is as radioactive as possible, so that the Biden folks don't ever get any idea about talking to Iran. Now, the other thing that I noticed is that I'm on a couple of email lists for Israeli propaganda. And I was getting one in my mail today on Nikki Haley calling out John Kerry. And it was a very typical neocon calling out a neoliberal for being too soft on defending our greatest ally. And, the whole situation just that whole headline just screams like 2000s era politics. You have two groups that are, very pro-Israel, the neocons and the neoliberals. And the neocons are mad at the neolibs for some slight against Israel that, objectively speaking, if you look at the situation, is, never any kind of slight. It's just they don't quite, kiss Israel's behind as, quite as overtly as the neocons do. And for that, we're supposed to believe that the neoliberals, like John Kerry, are anti-Israel. Now, the other school of thought on why this was leaked, I'm sure there's a lot of people talking about this, but, I heard it from, I believe, George Samueli, brought up, well, the elections in Iran are coming up kind of soon, and putting out something like this is obviously going to be very damaging to Zarif and Rouhani and their whole, I guess, nice guy approach. Because, if you try and read, the reports coming out about this interview and the things that Zarif said from an Iranian perspective, it sounds like Zarif is really, really soft on America. And that he is criticizing, the great demigod general, Qasem Soleimani, who is, very, very popular in Iran. The cult of Qasem Soleimani kind of seems to me like I don't know who we would compare him to here in the United States, but maybe in Florida he would kind of be, in the Florida context, even if I can't think of a national U.S. Equivalent. And we have no equivalent here, though. But the closest thing would be like the popular appeal of Grady Judd, the sheriff of Polk County. Grady Judd is this, big tough on crime guy who is, very aggressive in things and is generally well known and well respected, throughout the state in a very, in a sort of a populist way. They both kind of have that, that strongman vibe to them, even though neither of them are government executives. In the case of Qasem Soleimani, he was a military leader. In the case of Grady Judd, he's a sheriff. But people have this sort of instinctual loyalty to him as, hey, he'll keep us safe. And so Zarif going after Soleimani in this way, who had a much more, cultish following than, than anyone in the U.S. I would certainly never compare the popularity of Grady Judd to Soleimani in that sense. I just mean in terms of the kinds of figures they are, in the way that they're sort of political yet not political. Zarif's lamentations about Soleimani and the IRGC are going to hurt them immensely in the upcoming elections in Iran, and that could allow more hawkish folks to take power in that country. And so you have this perverse symbiotic relationship between the American hawks and the Iranian hawks, both ganging up on the Iranian doves. It really is quite sad, because, I've seen interviews with Zarif. He speaks good English, which is obviously a plus if he's trying to deal with the United States, and I feel like he could be somebody that you could at least deal with. And so would it really be better for the United States if Zarif and Rouhani are replaced by people who, really, really believe in the death to America stuff and really don't want to, be our friends? Because, if you consider what Zarif and Rouhani have been willing to agree to as far as, the Iran deal goes, there is no real reason for them to sign that deal, other than, just wanting to show their goodwill, because they were already in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. I guarantee you that the United States of America not only would we have never signed that deal, but the very idea of the Iran deal, if it were, say, the America deal, and Iran was trying to impose it on us, nobody would go for that. People would be offended. It would be outrageous that some other country is trying to tell America, what we can do, especially if we already have some other actual real treaty that says we won't do that thing. Imagine if Russia came in and imposed a treaty on the United States and said, or not a treaty, some kind of deal, the America deal, imposed by Russia, hey, America, if you want to have nuclear power, you got to disarm all of your nuclear bombs. And of course, that is not quite totally analogous to Iran, since Iran has never had a nuclear bomb, and that's a whole, the whole hysteria about Iran getting a nuclear bomb and the history of that. I mean, that could be multiple days. It would take me to cover that, but so I'm not going to get into that today. But the bottom line is this story about John Kerry in Iran, total BS. Disregard. This has this just stinks of bad people on all sides. Bad folks in Iran, the real hawks in Iran trying to make Zarif look bad. The Israel lobby trying to make any sort of idea of even talking to Iran toxic, and of course the American hawks. All three of these folks are people who, if you're just speaking from an American perspective, have interests which are contrary to those of the average American. These are the people who want you to be upset at John Kerry for this specific reason. So even if you're someone like me who's never liked John Kerry and still doesn't like John Kerry, this is not a reason to be mad at John Kerry. So with that said, I'm going to cut it off here for today.